points on a month-to-month basis. So definitely be tracking those things, right? We don't just put these into the deck just for fun and to have some giggles. Right? We do so, and we give you that data on a day-over-day, week-over-week, month-over-month basis because it's critically important to be tracking these things. They're in my notebook, right? They're right here. So just it's really important. So just keep doing it, and we move on to point number 3, which is on the Russell. So U.S. stock market crash. Number 2.
Toilet paper.
Just alluded to on the S&P, but the Russell.
I can't help you.
Big drawdown again since August, where we went short SPY.
Yep,
Short
no.
Germany. It's all. But we've been short Russell. Its cycle crash is down minus 29.2%. That Russell vol up to 24.11. Big move. So again, if we go back, why don't we go? Can you pull up the volatility for the equities by chance? So look, there you go, perfect. So again, the VIX, RVX, VIXN, GVZ, OVX are all listed right here. You can see the VIX, the RVX, and the NASDAQ vol, VXN, Russell and NASDAQ are up in the 20s, so 24 spot 11 for Russell, 23 spot 4 VXN. On a day-over-day basis, those have big moves, plus 148 basis points for the VXN, plus 215 for the Russell, plus 134 for the VIX. It's knocking on the door. It's at the low end of the chop bucket. Chop bucket, as a reminder, is 19.29. Decimal bucket is 19. F bucket is 29. So keep track of that. Volatility is absolutely elevating. You're seeing that in OVX and GVZ as well. Certainly over the last, on a month-over-month basis, what we've seen. GVZ on a month-over-month basis is up 704 basis points, 68%. OVX is up 1,724 basis points, which is up 63.5%. So big moves, and you're actually kind of seeing that correlate as well to the risk ranges. You can see the GVZ, the gold risk range put in a lower low and a higher high. So again, when volatility kind of is expanding, you're going to get wider ranges. When it's shrinking, you're going to get, basically an indication of lower volatility. So again, the oil risk range, higher low, also a lower high. So that was something to note today, right? A lower high in oil, a lower low in actually Brent, and you also got you got higher highs and lower lows in natty gas. So we are long natty gas as well. We added that back a few days ago as well, UNG. So that's back on in the re-ranked product. The other interesting one, and we're short silver, but that put in a higher low and a higher high today. So could be a little bit of divergence. It is remains bearish trend, so really just kind of track that. It is bearish trend, but when you're seeing a bearish trend putting in a higher low and a higher high, kind of gives you pause. Maybe you don't go right back to the wood on silver here, as it moves to the top of the range. But anyway. The other call out too along those similar lines is XLU. We do remain short of utes and rate sensitivity generally. However, we did see a higher low, but also a lower high in the XLU risk range this morning. So again, just gives you a little bit of pause. Maybe utes are changing. They were the top number 3 in terms of the sector. Now they were down minus 87 basis points. However, it was kind of one of the top ones, or I guess least down versus things like XLI down minus 2.41, XLB down minus 2.59, Jets, man, Jets got hammered, minus 4.38%. You do not want to be an airline stock right now. So again, just stick with the process. I think we pulled up the eyeball table. I'd love to kind of draw on that. The other call outs too from the risk range, Tesla, NVIDIA, big lower lows and big lower highs. So again, that low end of the risk range on Tesla is now down at 215. NVIDIA is at 408, and you're seeing, excuse me, the Tesla eyeball down there at the bottom is plus 20%. So it is a premium. It is 1.0 times on a 1-year Z-score. But yes, let me kind of draw on this a little bit. Where is the pen? Here we go. All right. So again, XLU, just going back to that component. You got it right here, XLU. Oh, what do I need to do? Okay. There you go, XLU, minus 7. but that's going down this way, right? So it was minus 17 yesterday, minus 13 a week ago, plus 15 a month ago, and you're sitting at a negative. So that is kind of an indication, one of the tools in the toolbox for it being more bearish, right? So, but you kind of got to combine it all, right? You got to combine the risk range, the eyeball table, with volume and volatility of that underlying product, and also paying attention in RTA. Like, has Keith gone and hit the button on XLU, especially if it's trading at like near the top of the risk range, and he hasn't. So that should also tell you something. But again, the other big call out here that I wanted to write down. Oh, XLC. XLC is right here, plus 34%. You're getting a plus 1.7 times on the trailing 12-month Z-score. Big call out. I think you know, if you look at the risk range product again, Meta and Google, higher lows in the Meta. You are seeing a bit of lower highs there as well. However, you are getting big, nice premiums. If you kind of correlate XLC, come all the way down here, right? And you got my TOT just going, you know, piggybacking off of the top three things in the rates component. TOT sitting right here at plus 5. It was minus 2 yesterday. It was circle. And again, this is just sort of like some complacency. You're just sitting at 0.2 times. It's not negative, but it's just something to be kind of paying attention to a little bit. The other component too on gold, which is kind of interesting, is gold's there at a plus 7% eyeball premium, and just sort of again, just like a little bit of complacency sitting there. And on XLE, you know, it was the best performer yesterday, as I mentioned earlier. But you have an eyeball premium kind of building up in there. However, it is kind of on a trailing 12-month Z-score, just sitting at 0.1 times. Kind of these things, the eyeball table, you know, don't over focus on the eyeball table, but certainly use it to help leverage your decision making and timing. It's all about timing and execution, right? So just keep at it. And with that, we've done, somehow I covered 15 minutes. Look at that. We'll go to questions. Oh, sorry. General, I'm sorry. One last thing on my bad, buddy.
Good morning, everybody. By the way.
Good morning. The GEX flip line. We are remaining in negative territory. That flip level is 4,373. So keep an eye on that. The risk reward on the SP is minus, basically pretty even. 1.21 risk reward, minus 1.5 to the downside on the S&P risk range, plus 1.24% to the upside. There's the GEX flip level. So yeah, just kind of paying attention to that as well. I think, let me just pull it up so I'm not misquoting tier 1. Sorry, my computer went quiet on me.
What do you need? I got all the charts for you here, Roberto.
Oh, perfect. Let's go. Can you just pull up the summary chart from Craig from this morning? By chance? There, perfect. Yeah, so implied vol, I think these are some key call-outs, right? So implied vol jumped ahead of Powell's speech today, and we're expecting kind of moves of around 1%. And on that bottom point, on a flat close, you could see approximately 19 billion in buying requirements from vol control funds, and volatility perhaps go down into the low wells. So I think just kind of wanted to call that out. Negative gamma can go both directions. It's really just kind of like an elevated volatility component. So keep that in mind, right? So basically price action starts, I think we saw it, what was that on Monday? Yeah, Monday, Tuesday. We saw basically negative gamma and market kind of moved higher, moved lower, and we end up ending the day flat, right? So just kind of pay attention. That's kind of the gamma component. Having this as another tool in your toolbox, combine that with the risk range, combine that with our stat pack, and you're going to be off to the races. All right, Genron, let's go to Q's.
Yeah, good morning. So for anybody who doesn't know, Robert is here for all your beginner questions, all the new people, all the people who want to get into the hedge process. Robert is your guy. You're a busy guy today, Robert. What else are you doing later today?
I know. I think the studio's gonna get sick of me. We're hosting the REIT show with Rob Simone, so that's going on.
But more importantly for everybody,
I
know. we want people to watch the REIT show.
So that's 11. I'm just gonna run through the gamut though, Genron. Listen, it's important. So we got the REIT show at 11. We got subscriber orientation at approximately 11:30, so call it 11:35. So if you haven't attended that, that's I host that with Matt Moran, who's our
then I switched to Liberty Mutual and saved hundreds. I know.
Thank you very much, Aline. Actually, I'm going to exactly explain the thinking behind that, and I would conclude it with something which actually would be maybe my question for Ivan, although I'm sure that he has many more questions for me, but I want to have one for him as well. The idea there in the book is first introduction of this new concept of homophobia, which basically is empirically something that we can show. There is already, after the book, several papers that I published with several co-authors on this. The idea is the following. To make it very simple, in a classic capitalist case, with Ricardo and Marx, you have 2 or 3 groups of people. You have capitalists, landlords, workers. When you line them up according to their incomes, the assumption, and that was based on the reality of the time, was that they don't overlap. In other words, you don't have capitalists who are poorer than workers, and capitalists receive 100% of their income from profit. Workers receive 100% of their income from labor. So it's very simple and very stratified structure. Nowadays, what we find, for example, in advanced capitalist economies, US, but it is actually, I have the data, Austria, Italy, the Netherlands, Germany, like every country, we find that there is an increasing proportion of people who are at the top decile by total income, but they are also the top decile by labor income and the top decile by capital. So in other words, to give you an idea, you might have CEOs of large companies or people who are working in a IT business or something, who either through backgrounds or maybe because they've been paid a lot and then they saved that money, are both drawing large wage incomes, and they are large capitalists in the sense that they have lots of property, a lot of financial capital, and they have invested that and have returns. And this is really a new phenomenon. And that new phenomenon is good because it really gets rid of this polarization or stratification by class that I mentioned. But on the other hand, establishes really a sort of a group or a new class or the elite, which is very stable because it has both types of income, and then it's being reinforced by what Shalini said, by intermarriage, for which we also have the data showing that people of the same education or same income level are increasingly marrying each other compared to 30 or 40 years ago. And the last point that I actually go to Ivan is that they are also people who are using lots of money to control or to fund the political process. So then you can see the logic of that. I become rich both in labor and capital income. So really fluctuations, could be unemployment or stock exchange or whatever, really don't affect me because I could always have the other source of income to sort of help me over the difficult times. I have a partner who is also of the same sort of status as I. We invest quite a lot in our children, and I'm using, for example, Daniel Markovich's book about meritocracy there. And then finally, we are able to control the political process. So the question then becomes, does democracy then really, and that's, I don't want to impose that even maybe he has other things to speak about, but does democracy then really end up in a kind of a plutocratic regime? So that would be, I think, one possible outcome of that particular constellation of forces.
Thank you very much. I'll start with the fact that I really believe it's very important. It's a very important book exactly for what you said. There is now quite a lot of criticism of meritocracy. So social inequality is recognized in political power. The old kind of a dull idea that economic and income inequality is not hurting political equality in democracies obviously does not work anymore. but the way you are also putting the historical origin of the political capitalism, your reinterpretation and putting communism, particularly outside of the West, I find critically important. Because interestingly enough, there are two words that are missing from your book and they're important. They're democracy and totalitarianism. And this is the way basically the United States and China normally are treated today. And I agree with you that it is much more difficult to understand the dynamics if we stay with this kind of a clash of a system defined like this. Because what you're saying, and I believe that this is great, and Daniel Markovits also had this, before the high class was the leisure class. Now basically a top American lawyer is going to work as much as the working class Indians basically work about the working class in England in the 19th century. So you have this overworked elite. And this overworked elite has a very specific view on the political system. First, basically they believe that they're the working class. They do believe that they achieve everything by then. It's very much based on education, but they're the productive class. Secondly, what is difficult for them is how to help their kids to inherit their status. For the aristocracy, it was easy. You're born an aristocrat, you're dying an aristocrat. Here you should incredibly invest in the education of your kids. And as a result of it, my is that part of it may start to resent the system, but the winners start to resent the system. It's becoming too tough. You play with your kids when they're very old. They try to plan their lives, how they're going to get into college. These kids start basically to have nervous breakdowns. The idea is this is the life that you want to live and so on. But as a result of it, if you're going to invest so much in your kids, you should be sure that the system is going to remain the way it is. And I do believe this is the interesting story because these are people who are trying to keep democracy under control because they don't see so much kind of the value of the other people contributing. It's very different from the traditional elites who know that they are privileged. For the first time in several elites, we know privilege. And this is why when you go to the political system and you try to compose a proposal, you really believe that others don't care about it. And this is why obsession of populism. So all these people who basically they don't care about the system, they can destroy the system because they don't have a stake in it. And from this point of view, I found also very interesting that while basically you see this kind of meritocracy, which is not based in intergenerational social mobility, which was justified, is a major problem for this type of liberal democratic capitalism that we face in the area of the side. But on the other side, all of the corruption is and this is interesting. Because in a certain way, in the way some people in the West should manage social mobility in order to keep the same way basically political capitalism, corruption should be managed. It should not be destroyed. It should not be reduced. It should not be allowed to get out of control. And I found it very interesting because as I'm going to stop it here, because you started with two very important kind of assumptions, and I'll try to push you to flesh that. So you said capitalism now. power at the time the United States is losing its economic power. America is losing not because capitalism is losing, but because capitalism is winning. But how this form of capitalism, how the political capitalism and meritocratic liberalism, what kind of a competition that they have? From this point of view, it's not the Cold War, where the Soviets tried to basically, based on these universal assumptions, to export their system to others. What is the foreign policy for political capitalism? Because I do believe this is going to be important when you're going to try to see what kind of a conflict we can expect.
Yes, actually, can I just say a few words? I really like the fact that Ivan mentioned that somewhat by design, but maybe somewhat also by accident, I really did not use the words, or practically not, democracy, authoritarianism, populism. Even Trump appears only once and in connection to reduction of taxes in the U.S. Because I really think that that the problems and issues are deeper than that, and that by using these words we are really just getting superficial understanding of the issues. So I think actually we have to go, and I believe that to some extent I try to do that, to go deeper and more historically and to really think things through better. I want to say one word about corruption and what Ivan rightly sort of contrasted the fact that the ruling class in Western societies, first is hardworking, secondly does not believes that actually whatever they have is deserved, and thirdly they are actually don't perceive themselves as a ruling class. So it's a very interesting situation. When it comes to corruption in political capitalism, I argue, and I will skip now the rationing for that, or reasoning for that, that it is an intrinsic, immanent feature of political capitalism. And that feature then really is there in any system of political capitalism. The problem is that corruption tends to spread, and I use the metaphor of a river or a flood. So if you don't do anything, it will just spread and flood all the areas until essentially starts really significantly undermining the belief in the system, the functioning of the system, inequality in the system, the role of the ruling elite also in the system. And then you would actually have a sort of return of practically Kuomintang situation of the 1930s. And in that sense, I see the current anti-corruption campaign not as a campaign that would ever eradicate corruption, but as a campaign that would push the corruption within the riverbed where it should be. So it will continue in China and in countries of political capitalism, and then it would spread out again, and then there will be yet another anti-corruption campaign. And so it is not an anomaly of the system. I think it's a feature of the system. And if you look at other countries, and there I didn't write in the book, but I mean, one could actually see Russia as well as a country where an anti-corruption drive would be very popular. There may be some other reasons why the government there cannot do that, but clearly we see that, for example, in Navalny's campaign, which technically is totally non-political, but really focuses on corruption, how much support or interest it garners simply from that, because it is, I think, one of the key issues that such systems have to face.
This is an interesting point because I wanted to go back to Ivan's book on anti-corruption. Ivan has, I don't know, Branko, if you know this book of Ivan's, but Ivan did a lot of work showing the functionality, not the dysfunctionality of anti-corruption campaigns in many countries, and he was looking at actually, I mean, he could make the whole argument himself, but I'll just make 2 points which always struck with me. How the entire discourse on corruption is an artifact of the end of the Cold War, because the World Bank and the IMF decided to then start using the C word, which was banned until then in their official discourse. And
Did you
then
hear that,
the
lady?
Transparency,
No.
Transparency International, then you get the corruption index, etc.
Oh, outside.
So
Yeah.
there's a
Yeah.
historical genesis to this entire discourse on corruption and corruption. Of showing exactly the work that the anti-corruption campaigns do. So maybe both of you, I mean, Ivan could carry on and conclude on that. Then I want to come back to one other point on education, because I think that interests me in the Chinese case as much as in the US.
I very much agree with you, because my major argument was the following. The Cold War basically ended, and if before the Cold War we knew that poor countries are corrupt, then we basically were told that corrupt countries are poor. And this is kind of a change. And this is a change because my major argument was also that in a free trade world, corruption is a hidden form of protectionism. So suddenly, basically, all kinds of multinationals and others, they see a problem because in a certain way, corruption is very much based on a lot of knowledge. It's not the big bribe that wins. It's very much based on a society story. But I find the idea of the anti-corruption very important for the Chinese case, what you're describing, is because also what the Chinese have learned from the communist period is that the political capitalism is not going to function if the elite feels too secure. Because then they're going to do what any elite is going to do, and what basically you believe that also some of the liberal elites in the West are doing. You're trying totally to consolidate your power, you try to get everybody out, you're basically stifling the system. So how are you injecting insecurity in the elites while keeping the supreme power of the state? And of course, in the Mao case, it was a cultural revolution. But now the anti-corruption campaigns are playing this role. In a certain way, you're injecting the level of the insecurity in the elites, which allows the political capitalism to go. And this is why I find your interpretation of corruption is much more important, because it's political logic and not its economic logic that is very much there. While on the Western side, and this is before going to the education, because I do believe Shalini is right that they're very much connected, you have strange story. You have an elite, social mobility has been decreased, but this was compensated by the mobility of the elite themselves. And this is a physical mobility. So in a certain way, one of the things that also scares a lot of people in the Western democracies is that the elite simply have an exit. If you're a banker, you have such a convergence of your expertise that you can move anywhere. And this was very much seen during the Greek crisis, in which basically the Greek elite simply left. They said, this country is not good for us. This is interesting, and from this point of view, I'm also going, when you go on education, to keep this in mind, to what extent crisis like COVID-19 is injecting a different type of insecurity in the elites. Because this is one of the few crises in which you cannot run out of. You should stay where you are. Nevertheless, of course, you can make privileges, you're going to have your better vaccination, and so on and so on. But at the end of the day, you cannot get out. Suddenly, you have a place. In order to stay home, you should define something like home. And this is why I do believe I'm interested to see how this latest crisis, also according to you, is going to affect this very strong Weberian framework that you have put in the book. And I do believe very few people were really daring to go with classical big picture analysis, which I admire you for doing.
I wanted to come back actually to a very simple sociological question, which is, I was taught in all my training in sociology that education is the great equalizer. Education is the path to social mobility, and that Western industrial societies, in contrast to pre-modern feudal societies, etc., are societies in which education is the leveler, right? And is the way to fair life chances. Of course, education is also, and this is where one point becomes interesting in another way, is education in certain disciplines is also the way to international mobility. And this is the case with economics, this could be the case with natural sciences, it's not so much the case with humanities, etc. So there is a certain type of education, of course engineering, medicine, professional schools, definitely. But so what you argue in the book is that education itself is creating disparities, creating a new closure, one through marriage, secondly through the ideology of meritocracy, and thirdly through reproducing privilege by restricting access to elite institutions. And this is where the corruption story is also interesting, because you remember all these cases in the US of late where elites are trying to cheat the system to get the kids into these top institutions. So this is where one also needs to see that suddenly education, or this access to the elite education institutions, becomes a space in which corruption begins to be exercised. In the Indian case, you had, for example, always the possibility for what was called donors' seats in medical colleges or engineering colleges. So you could pay a huge donation to the college and get your kid in if the kid didn't get in a normal competition. And the privatization of education, because when I grew up in India, we only had state education. So it was difficult to have donor seats in state education institutions. But once you privatize higher education, you are opening out that field much more to the influence of money. So I see lots of interesting trajectories here between that we should take a look at. And then my question to you here in this case would be, what is the role of education in a system like the Chinese one of political capitalism? There was enormous meritocracy historically, one which was very much about competition, also about social mobility, etc. And now we need to understand what role does education play in that other version of capitalism.
Yes, on the Chinese system, let me just say very briefly that I believe that there are many features in the Chinese system, in China rather, that are very similar to this educational sorting that happens especially in the United States. So both of them are really the systems that put huge emphasis on education, and these systems are essentially hijacked by the elites. We actually have for China the data as well in terms of the background of people who are in the top Chinese universities, and it's very similar story to the US story, although these are public universities, but the access is of course facilitated to the children of the elite. Now, in the US, when Shalini, you mentioned, I think this is such an enormous topic, which is extremely interesting, because I think that education is used as a validation criterion to maintain or reproduce the elite. So that elite is investing an incredible amount of money in children, and actually this is probably the elite historically that in some sense is the smartest elite, most educated elite, and the elite that is investing the most in their offspring. And that investment is not only when we look at how much Harvard costs versus state colleges, that investment starts when you're like about 2 or 3, because you really have to count all the steps that could lead you, because you're not going to show up when you're 18 and say, I would like to go to Harvard. You actually have to start thinking about that when you're 2. I can give you many examples, for example, from Europe. There was a friend of mine from France, excellent grades, a phenomenal student, and she applied to American top colleges. She was immediately rejected because she didn't have all the other accoutrement that, of course, in the US you realize you have to have. She didn't jump from a parachute, she didn't conduct orchestra when she was 10, she didn't study the most recondite language when she was 11, which all of that is fake, but at least you get somebody to sort of write stories like that. She just went as a student. So that's but why the investments in jumping from parachute and leading the orchestra is done by the parents. So there is this enormous effort which is done. And then, of course, the children go to these schools, whether they graduate, as I said, what they learn there, I think largely is immaterial, and that's what you actually mentioned. I said I come from a country where actually you bribe professors in order to give you a good grade. But this is not the locale where you actually locus, where you bribe people in the US. you bribe them to get accepted, and that's why this scandal happened in California with the acceptances. Because once you're accepted, of course, you graduate 99%. So it really doesn't matter, what you learn, how you learn, what you have done, because you really basically have a stamp that you went there, and that essential stamp guarantees you jobs that would actually then give you very high earnings. And if you combine that with the financial support that you would have from your parents, obviously you do create a group, an elite, which then is reproducing itself. And I think this is really a very concerning development combined with homophobia that I mentioned before, because one can wonder, like, what will happen, how that elite would function after 3 generations, They are not going to accept that they are no longer the elite.
And this is to question to both of you, because how this relates to the changing demographic structure of society. Because in a certain way you're investing so much in your kids, not simply to keep the social status, but because they're going to live in a world in which they're not going to have many relatives. In a certain way you have 1 or 2 kids families and so on. So all the investment in the education, which is a totally individualistic strategy, you're kind of trying to help them to survive socially, economically, and so on, when they cannot rely on anybody. And this is why I'm interested, and this is interesting, of course, for both for the West, but also for China, where some of this story is there.
So this is interesting because you do see in India, for example, one of the kinds of things you would rely on very much, especially among those who don't have very high means, would be family networks. In India, they would even be caste networks, village networks, neighborhood networks, but all kinds of networks, which are bringing you access to all kinds of things. With the, of course, a small family, especially one-child families are rare still in India. China would be a different case, but 2 child families, etc. Of course, there is this enormous investment in education, but interestingly, in the Indian case, what you're also seeing is that among the very poor, anybody who can afford to pay even a little bit of money wants the child not in a public school, public in the sense of in India it's a government school, but in a private school, and especially from kindergarten onwards, so from the age of 4 and 3, in an English medium school. So although you speak no English at home, neither of the parents is educated or school educated, you still have the feeling that if you give your child that education, there is a chance of upward mobility. The problem is, this is not necessarily true. So you are getting a lot of very frustrated young people who are well qualified, not from top elite institutions, but well qualified in comparative terms, who are finding no jobs. So that is one of the kinds of problems which I think is also is fueling a certain kind of right-wing populism in India. That is one of the support bases of especially rural youth who has managed to get education, coming to urban areas and not finding the jobs. So there's a lot of resentment, and there is a lot of anger, and there is a feeling of fake promises and being cheated out of things, and that is what is partly also being mobilized.
But because it goes very much the same. In a certain way, if you see the Arab Spring, there was a lot of sociology that the most kind of a vulnerable group is those who bet it on education. They get a second-class education, and the education is not paid back. But the same is with some of the colleges in the U.S. You go, and basically your income does not go up. And I do believe this is why your story about public education is interesting. And I do believe the other interesting thing that we should talk is exactly the migration story and citizen non-citizens, because it's provocative, but at least in my view it catches something very important. In Eastern Europe, if you basically read papers, you're going to see that this is places that are not allowing foreigners to come because of the anti-refugee sentiments and others. On the other side, the EU member states that received most labor migrants for the last 3 years was Poland. And not it's only because of Ukraine, but also 20,000 Pakistanis. Why? Because they are not going to get political rights. So in a certain way, you're ready to allow them to enter the labor market. So opposite, normally Europeans, we said that we like refugees, but we don't like labor migrants, and because we cannot make a distinction between the two, this is why we're opposing refugees. The truth is just the opposite. In a certain way, we're quite open, because of the shortage on the labor market, for this type of a labor migrants. But in order for them to be accepted, and this is the interesting and provocative insight that Branko comes with, they should be guaranteed that they're never going to become full citizens. So if this is true, we're going to have an interesting implication for democracy. Imagine Bulgaria in 30 years. 20-25% of the people on the labor market do not have voting rights. 40-45% of the voters are on a retirement age. And another 20% of the voters are living outside of the country. They can vote, but they're not going to pay taxes. How this democracy is going to function?
But I think this goes back to your earlier work, Branko, as well, where you're making a strong argument for citizenship light, as I said, where you were saying one of the problems with, or maybe to really frame your argument very briefly, your argument is one of the few ways of equalizing life chances and equalizing income inequality is through allowing transnational, international physical mobility of labor, because your income depends so much on where you were born and on the location and where you are earning. That being the case, migration would be an absolute key factor for reducing income inequalities. However, it hits up against the roadblock of people not wanting to fully integrate migrants through political rights, etc., despite the whole rhetoric that it's the migrants who don't really want to integrate. But this is a different story we need not go into here. But what you're getting is then a deep, or what you're even advocating quite provocatively in some of your earlier work is you would increase the political acceptance of migrants if you were to decouple social, economic, and political rights, and you would afford them economic rights, certain social rights, but make sure that they are not given the promise of full political equality as citizens. This may be a way to increase acceptance for migration and therefore a reduction to global inequalities of income, right? So I think it's a very forceful argument, but it's a problematic argument in many ways, and it would be wonderful to have you comment on it.
Yeah, let me, try to comment briefly on that. Before I go to the argument itself, which actually, Shalini, you have presented quite well, so there is not much for me to say there. But let me go back to what Ivan said before. In that section of the book, I actually argue, that was new compared to global inequality. I argue that citizenship has now become really an ideal category. It is become technically totally degrounded. Now, leaving aside COVID now, where actually we have been grounded, technically citizenship has been degrounded in the following way. In the past, where first you had to live in the country where you were the citizen from, and you actually receive incomes from work in that place. Now, let me give you the example, of an American who lives in France, and receives income, so he's not really living in the United States anymore, he's still US citizen, and receives income. Imagine that he's receiving income from Social Security, but that Social Security income is the result of American investments in China, for instance. So essentially what is then happening, you have American investments in China, money is coming from China, from Chinese companies, workers, and so on, transiting simply through the US government, which then sends you that check to France. So you have totally degrounded your sources of income and your life, but you still keep this ideal category, which then becomes essentially one piece of paper, which is citizenship. And what Ivan mentioned before is that imagine a country like Bulgaria, where a significant part of the population lives abroad and keep the rights to vote. And this is actually happening more and more. You have lots of Filipinos who are actually voting from abroad. You had in the last case, I think 6 million Americans who voted outside the United States. So you're really having an increased percentage of the population whose fortunes are really fundamentally divorced from the fortunes of the country where they're officially voters and participants in the electoral process. And on the other hand, you have people, and again in the United States, you have 10 million undocumented aliens, not undocumented foreigners, that actually also don't participate in the process.
Right.
So you really see there the situation which from the sort of earlier point of view of what citizenship is, and go back to the French Revolution, was absolutely unimaginable compared to the current situation where your citizens don't live there, and many other people who live there are really not citizens. So we really have that peculiar situation, and given that peculiar situation, and given the rejection or resistance of many countries, particularly in Europe, to accept increased migration, that's where I come with a proposal that Shalini has outlined, which essentially is a compromise solution between greater, reduction of the rights of migrants to citizenship in order to have a greater acceptance of migration of migrants to come to your country. And I do that in a very simple way. I just put it in a graph and say to you, would you be willing to accept one additional citizen if I tell you and guarantee you that that citizen would stay here for 3 or 5 years, would be linked to a job, and then would leave? And I think if there is this negative, there is this trade-off that you're more willing to accept somebody if you are assured that actually he's not going to stay here forever and be a citizen. I think that my case rests on that actually we would be willing as individuals, like people in Western Europe would be willing to actually trade off these things.
But this creates also very interesting, because being a political scientist, I'm trying to see the political implications of all this. Imagine this type of a degrounded citizenship. So what is the community that basically functions? And this community is totally symbolic. It's not this kind of a total divorce between the economic interests of the community and the political interest is particularly important, because before the citizen was doing 3 important things. He was defending the nation, he was dying for it. So now the drones are going to play this role. Then he was a taxpayer, but as we see, many of these people are not going to be the taxpayer. And honestly, investors became much more important than the taxpayers when you're deciding economic policies. So we're going to have a totally redefinition of what nationalism means for these national communities. And I do believe that this is why the problem of the right is going to be interestingly important, because political rights are much more becoming the privilege of belonging to certain community, which now has become a virtual community. It's not controlling the economy, it is basically not very much there. And the easiest for this to happen is European Union, because in a certain way the mobility is highest. So for example, if you are an Indian and decide to come to Bulgaria, are you really eager to come to Bulgaria, citizen, if you believe that you can come in 5 years in Austria, so you're not seeking change of your country? And this is why the European Union is making it easier compared with anybody else to give the citizenship right, because it's a national citizenships and they are not as attractive before, because the market is not a national market anymore. It is very different, of course, when it comes to Germany or Sweden because of other things. But imagine, I didn't see many Syrians or Afghans really fighting for the Bulgarian citizenship, because for them this is the way to move in Europe in general. The citizenship that they go after are different citizenships.
I think you have a point, however, Branko, I do want to ask both of you a question on this, which doesn't touch on your book, but touches on another aspect of citizenship, of which people like Marshall, etc., that they were making their distinction between political, economic, and social rights did not take on, and that is cultural differences. I think citizenship has gone so coupled with the whole citizenship has become a question of do you really belong culturally, then you start defining what the ethno-national basis of this national culture is. It could be religious, it could be ethnic. So the political community is getting defined more and more in more and more countries in terms either of ethnic or national homogeneity, and so that even parts of your own political community can be turned into people who don't belong. And I think that whole cultural dimension is underrepresented in this discussion of what could lead to political acceptance. So even if you were to temporarily accept some people coming, the whole, at the moment, a lot of the discourse, because of the right-wing attack on migration, has shifted to the, not only the absence of cultural integration, but the fact that the migrants will never be and do not want to be culturally integrated. So I'm just presenting the one facet of the argument, I think, which one would need to take into consideration if one wants greater acceptance for migrants, and refugees is a different story, but
No, you're absolutely right. I'm always giving this example. There is a restaurant here in one of the districts in Vienna who was started as an Italian restaurant. And over time, basically now, the owner is not an Italian. None of the cook is not an Italian. None of the waiters are Italian. None of them speaks any Italian, and none of them has ever been in Italy. So the major question is this an Italian restaurant or a restaurant with an Italian food? And from this point of view, basically the European answer is if an Italian does not feel at home, it's not an Italian restaurant. And on the other side, basically the kind of a much more, the German cosmopolitan answer is going to be read the menu, listen to the music, and don't ask about the cook. And I do believe this is going to be quite interesting, and particularly for the small, this is why Europe is more interesting, because you have these all small nations. The interesting about these European nations is that unlike French or Germans, they didn't have an imperial history. Strangely enough, they've been created by the disintegration of the empire, and they keep this kind of anti-colonial sentiment, anti-imperial sentiment in their national formation. So, you can be interested in these small cultures in which they believe that if you're not born there, but what it means to be born there, it's not a territory anymore. What about all these kids who do not speak, for example, Bulgarian, but can have the Bulgarian passport because they have parents? And I do believe this is why the cultural issue is becoming very interesting, because I can see this, by the way, in Bulgaria very much. You have for the first time, grandparents and grandchildren do not share language. Grandchildren have been born abroad. The parents did not basically teach them, for example, Bulgarian. So how are you going to define the cultural community? And this is becoming a very defensive cultural nationalism, extremely defensive. You go on something that is not alive. This is like the Italian restaurant.
Yeah, I wanted to say that actually, to explain again maybe the origin of this citizenship light and the proposal that we are talking about, it was based on my work on global inequality. As you know, in global inequality, when you line up people in the world by their income, and now I have really quite a lot of data, so it's basically every country with 100% house, you find that about between 50 to 60% of your income depends on the country where you were born. So the country where you are born is the most important determinant of your income. About 10 to 20% comes from the social class, social group that you were born in your country, and the remainder comes from all the other effects, like your education, luck, grit, ambition, whatever. So, if you have that situation that more than half of your income is determined by your country, then migration is an obvious way to actually make global inequality less and global poverty less. So that's where I come from. So I would then say, well, let's have an open migration. The problem is that many other people do not believe that that people, individuals, are like Atavars, so that I can just move you from this country A to country B, and nothing else happens except that your income increases and everything else is fine. And in the reaction to that view, I of course came up with that sort of a compromise solution with the trade-off that we just discussed. But before I did so, I have to say that I made a critique of the people who believe that, who are actually anti-immigrants, but they are oftentimes the same people who, like in the 70s and the 80s, were deriding countries that were limiting the inflow of capital. Because, let me put it like that, you had sort of a neoliberal paradigm that said, well, capital should really move without borders, and at the same time would be anti-migration. So, in my opinion, these two things really do not go together. Either you're in favor of globalization and free movement of all the factors of production, or you have to accept that actually somebody may be also against movement of capital into their country because they might believe that actually that capital also is changing relations in their own country in the way that you might not want migrants to change relations in your country. But anyway, so it's a long introduction, but the point was then that my proposal is a defensive proposal. It is a proposal that says, let's try still to reduce global inequality, to make people's lives better, and to reduce poverty by having the rich countries accept some migrants. Because an easy position that some people from rich countries have, they say, oh, we want, some migrants, and we want to give them all the rights, but then at the end of my border, I'm totally indifferent to the fact that actually 50% of somebody's income is determined by the fact that he comes from a poor country. So, they have made this very sharp split in fortunes of people between those who are able to emigrate and those who are not. And so that was the origin that I always want to mention, because the proposal per se oftentimes seems very sharp and sort of heartless, but it is really based on an acknowledgement first that free migration would be the best solution, or the first best, but because of the resistance that we face, we cannot implement it, and consequently we have reluctantly to accept the term.
I'm going to take one question here, which we have from someone whom both of you know well. We are back in a Bulgarian compatriot voice here. This is a question from our current fellow here, Albina Asmanova, whom you also know. I think, Branko, you've been in conversation with her. Albina's book, titled, I think it's called Capitalism on Edge, makes an argument to think about not just wealth and income, but the whole question of precarity and precariousness of livelihoods is central to the question of capitalism today. So I'm going to now read to you, both of you, Albina's question. And she says, you diagnose the social state of homoploutia as stable, but according to surveys that I review in my book, Capitalism on Edge, these people live in constant fear of losing it all, remaining in the rat race out of insecurity and of hating their lives, as Ivan has just pointed out. This has important political implications. If the winners in the distribution of social privilege pay too high a price for being winners, that is, the price of precarity, they might oppose capitalism as a social system that generates precarity, as she suggests. If, however, they are comfortable, as you, Branko, maintains, they would rather seek to maintain the system. Would both of you care to comment, Branko?
Well, I think that people who are talking about the elite, I don't think they feel precariousness. I think actually they feel very much in control. Their incomes are high, they are stable. I would not even discuss the fact that actually they have done extremely well during COVID financially. So I don't think that precariousness is actually something, and I discussed that, as you know, in the last chapter of the book. Precariousness is something that is really linked with obviously much less stable jobs, with the gig economy, and that's an interesting point we don't have the time to talk about today, it is linked with our ability to purchase more and more services and goods on the market, which in the past were created within a household, within a family. That's why actually I mentioned that I think that family is becoming an obsolete thing in a sort of modern capitalism. And that's why in Nordic countries the average household size is 1.8, because everybody lives by themselves. Simply why? Because they are able to purchase all the things on the market, whether it is the food that they eat, or somebody taking care of the dog, or somebody taking care if they have children, or somebody cleaning their home, all of that, and even renting their home. So they are able to purchase that, but the providers of these services are people with precarious jobs. So I would not see the elite as being in a precarious position.
I agree. It's not about precariousness in this case. It's about insecurity, and it's interesting how insecurity is going to work. And so, in the case of China, the problem is to have enough insecurity for the state to control, basically not allowing the elites to privatize the state. And by the way, from this point, your comparison with Russia is very interesting, because what President Putin gave to his elite is basically no precariousness at all. But if this is the case, then we should talk about two other types of distribution. And one of them, of course, is distribution of risk, where Shalini and Ulrich Beck have been working very much. The problem with this elite is not that they feel insecure simply about their money and so on, but also in the distribution of risk and distribution of blame, they feel kind of a less grounded than before. And this is why this obsession with anti-elite sentiments. This is this fear basically of any type of irrational populist movements and others, and this is why democracy starts to be perceived as a system which does not guarantee you reproduction of the system. And this is interesting because during the Cold War, the fear was nationalization. So if you're a capitalist in a classical capitalism, you know what the problem is. Now it's kind of slightly more complicated. You don't know exactly what is going to happen. The fact that others should like you is becoming critically important. And you have this strange elite which is very arrogant on one side, but very happy to blame itself for many things. I do believe now in the United States you're going to see to what extent basically self-humiliation is becoming a condition for keeping your position of power and privilege, particularly financially. If you see certain type of a corporate boards and others that are becoming more inclusive on racial and gender terms than at least rhetorically than others, you're going to understand, I do believe that this is my view, that this is Albena was pushing on this, that insecurity cannot be reduced to precariousness of the people who feel economically insecure. Paradoxically, the money that you have and the power that you have does not give you security that you're going to have before, based on origin or based on even belonging to a kind of a different type of political elite.
Let me just say on China, because I wanted to say that before, and I think that in a recent paper I end with that dilemma for China. And I think under Hu Jinping there was some movement towards that. If you have an oligarchic system where you would basically have increased corruption and greater security of oligarchy. The only way that you reduce this security of oligarchy is by having more of a practice system. So this is, I think, in some sense, ironic situation for China. Either they can have the power of the oligarchy, or they can have the power of one person. And the power of one person is that check on oligarchic power. So that's, I think, the dilemma that, or actually the choice that they currently have. And I think with Xi Jinping, that was, I think, very thought out, not only maybe because he likes to exercise power, maybe many people do like that, but I think that he sees that as a way to prevent all these sort of negative elements which would come with full oligarchic security, which indeed we see very well in Russia, where oligarchic, as you said, even where actually Putin is some kind of a general maestro who is guaranteeing oligarchic security to different constituencies.
This is interesting because in a certain way, the supreme leader, the Tsar, does not have one privilege that any other oligarch has. And this is the freedom to leave the country. So the Tsars don't go voluntarily in exile. They don't take holidays abroad.
No, no.
I have another.
Are grounded.
Yeah.
You're very grounded. This
Yeah.
is not being ungrounded. But yes, I mean, on the ungroundedness of Indian capital, you can also say something. Some of them have exited after having been accused of all kinds of corruption. So there is a very interesting problem about getting them back from England to come to answer for some of their misdeeds in India. They've run away with a lot of money from the banks. But what I have is a question here from Jan Sova, which goes in the direction. He's also a former fellow of ours from Poland. And that was one of the questions I was also going to ask you on the whole question of environment, because that is the other issue which is missing from the book. I was going to frame my question in terms of inequalities. He frames it differently. So my question to you would have been that I think one of your arguments in the earlier books of yours has been that the leveling off of inequalities between countries, so global inequality, is due to the economic rise of India and China. And the question I would have for you here would be that the ecological cost of that kind of high economic growth in both countries is probably not environmentally sustainable. So how would one factor in the ecological costs of leveling off that inequality? Jan Sova frames his question in a more, even wider context, and I read out his question to you. He says, capitalism, like any other human endeavor, is embedded in the web of life, and in this sense, it is not alone. In every enterprise, humans are accompanied by the rest of living beings. We can see that capitalism has fundamentally disturbed the web of life, and while Elon Musk may succeed in making humanity a multi-planetary species, in the process the Earth may stop being a multi-species planet. So what would be the place of nature and environment in your perspective on the possible futures of capitalism?
Okay, this is a huge question. I didn't write about climate change in the book first because I really don't know much about it, and certainly knew less when I was writing the book. But I have since been, as you probably know, involved in a debate with, on my blog and elsewhere with several people about big growth. And I'm a strong opponent of big growth, and I believe that the message that was actually message generated by big growth is fundamentally arithmetically unsustainable. It's essentially, if we argue that the world has reached the maximum GDP compatible with not exacerbating climate change, that has only two sort of, how should we say, implications. It's either that we will actually have to keep people in poverty now, which is 20% or even 30% of the world population, at that level of really utmost poverty. As you know, 10% are actually below the absolute poverty line, which of course they don't like to admit because they're not going to actually say, well, we really would like to keep all the people, poor people at the poverty level. Or alternatively, you have to propose extraordinary immiseration of the rich people in rich countries. And when I say extraordinary, I'm not talking about a reduction of income of 10%, but we're talking about a reduction of income of 60%. So that obviously is politically impossible. And I think actually why I criticize them is that they don't want to come out and openly state these facts, which are really arithmetic facts. So they talk about degrowth as some kind of a solution that seems to be, very cool and nice, and you go out and demonstrate and all of that, but they don't want to face the facts that either is linked with continued poverty for 1/3 of humankind, or with immiseration of the rich one. So that's where I'm actually got into the discussion with them, because I'm actually very much for trying decoupling. But their point of view is that decoupling is not sufficiently strong, so that actually it cannot help us, the world, hit the targets. So they want something much more radical than decoupling. On your question about, on your point about India and China, yes, but I think it's not really the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue is that the rich people are much greater producers of CO2 emissions. So in other words, it is not the countries, it's really the people. And then if we were serious about that, we should actually, as I said the other day, I'll stop there very briefly, we should actually put a list of 20 activities or commodities or services that should be taxed at the global level. And then you could actually have a global fund which will collect that money and which would then use for whatever, maybe for green energy or whatever you want to use it. But the object of your taxation is not the state. It should be individual who is producing that CO2 emission. So, but as you can see politically, that's a no-starter, because we are really discussing that sort of issues at the state level and then to the level of individuals who are contributing that. As you know, a person in the US is actually contributing, I think, 7 to 10 times more than a person in India. So, average.
But there are two aspects to this, and I agree with you entirely. I think the major question here is, what is the unit of analysis? And is the nation state your best unit of analysis to even understand some of these questions of carbon emissions, etc.? Because the rich across all countries are the major contributors. I take your point there. However, the question here would be also on the use of natural resources, which are finite. So the question is, degrowth may be a political problem and for you not even an economic option, but don't you think capitalism is really a problem because of the pace at which and the devastating pace at which it is using up natural resources which are actually finite? So the question is, capitalism will have to think of some ways. So at the moment it survives alone. Not that socialism was better at using natural resources. So I'm not making the point that communism was very much ecologically more sustainable. Not at all. I think both of those systems will have questions to address when it comes to ecological sustainability.
Well, yes and no. Let me put things maybe in a more provocative way. Technically, when people say we live in a finite planet, yes. But really, that limit, I think, is so far that it's like almost, we could say that the galaxy is also a finite system. In other words, technological change, and with incentives, which of course can lead to technological change, can always and has produced other substitutes for things which exist in nature. I mean, we know that from synthetic rubber onwards to all many chemical goods. So in other words, we can actually produce certain things that would happen to be in short supply, and with incentives that would be used to make, for example, naturally produced things more expensive. So then, of course, you would go and try to create a substitute or try to replace them. So I really, in that sense, I'm a technological optimist. I really do believe that technologically, again, with the right incentives, we do not, in reality, live in a finite universe in the sense of the resources that we need to have. And let me just, last point on that, say that if we look at these resources themselves, we keep on finding them more and more. In other words, what we believe was the quantity of a given resource, including oil, 40 years ago, is nowadays much more. And then on top of that, we might not even need, oil to run cars and trucks and other things, because we might move to electricity. And then maybe later we can move to solar energy. So in other words, I think that limit has been overemphasized in that.
So let me pick up maybe two other issues which you have been addressing in your earlier books. This one also addresses the whole issue of taxes. One of the points you make about taxes and changing tax incentives and tax structures is that there should be more public investment in education, because as we had said right at the beginning, the function of education as an equalizer is no longer given if you are restricting access to education. But the other argument you are making, in a sense similar to Piketty's argument, is that one way to get more equality, more redistribution would be through higher taxes, higher inheritance taxes, higher corporate taxes, etc. But your proposal also, in a sense, about taxes for lower taxes, including for lower income groups who would benefit from the higher taxation for the rich, was a little bit, I was reminded of someone like Fernando de Soto's argument a couple of decades ago, the idea of assets ownership, which he wanted to equalize more, right? Give the poor the legal ownership of the assets, which they can then use to secure loans, etc. So he was arguing that the poor, in especially developing countries, should have more access to asset ownership, whereas your argument, if I understand it rightly, has been more for an East Asian model of capitalism, with a very different kind of taxation, which should be more directed towards different taxation priority for the middle classes. So could you say something about how the kind of policy prescriptions on taxation look like, which follow from some of your analysis?
Yeah, I believe that I'm sometimes maybe irritated even when I see that every problem we seem to actually, from the left, we seem to just throw another tax at that problem. At least we claim that, very often these proposals are not accepted, but that really seems, in my opinion, an overkill. I think that we have to start with what is the objective of a given taxation. And I actually find Rawls in that respect very useful, because why Rawls was in favor of inheritance tax, and I'm of course just repeating that in my book, was because he thought that the essential feature of liberal capitalism, or actually liberal equality, what he calls, is to limit the advantages that are derived from your background. And these are two advantages that he wanted to limit in particular. One is the financial advantage, and that's why he was in favor of very strong taxation of inheritance. And the second one was educational advantage, and that's why he was very much in favor of free public education and the dominance of the public education versus private. So this is really, I think, my approach as well, is that actually we use tax because we want to accomplish something which is an objective, which is beyond taxation itself. And then another objective which I had was a provision, equalization of some of the equalization or deconcentration of capital ownership. In other words, if capital ownership is spread over to the middle classes where it normally is not, because middle classes in rich countries basically have housing as their main, almost the only asset. In that case, you would actually have increase in the capital share which can come through robotics and automation, not spreading into the interpersonal inequality. So you can see again why I'm arguing in favor of more widespread capital ownership is because I would like to delink the rising share of capital in total national income from its immediate transmission into the higher interpersonal inequality. Because if we all have the same share of our income derived from capital, then also mathematically, if capital becomes more important, we would all have the same increase of 10% of our income through capital. You still may be richer than me, but that gap is not going to increase in relative terms. I think that we And I actually find Rawls in that respect very useful, because why Rawls was in favor of inheritance tax, and I'm of course just repeating that in my book, was because he thought that the essential feature of liberal capitalism, or actually liberal equality, what he calls, is to limit the advantages that are derived from your background. And these are two advantages that he wanted to limit in particular. One is the financial advantage, and that's why he was in favor of very strong taxation of inheritance. And the second one was educational advantage, and that's why he was very much in favor of free public education and the dominance of the public education versus private. So this is really, I think, my approach as well, is that actually we use tax because we want to accomplish something which is an objective, which is beyond taxation itself. Then another objective which I had was the provision, equalization of somewhat of equalization, the deconcentration of capital ownership. In other words, if capital ownership is spread over to the middle classes where it normally is not, because middle classes in rich countries basically have housing as their main, almost the only asset. In that case, you would actually have increase in the capital share which can come through robotics and automation, not spreading into the interpersonal inequality. So you can see again why I'm arguing in favor of more widespread capital ownership is because I would like to delink the rising share of capital in total national income from its immediate transmission. Think share capital ownership is because I would like to delink the rising share of capital in total national income from its immediate transmission into the higher interpersonal inequality. Because if we all have same share of our income derived from capital, then also mathematically, if capital becomes more important, we would all have an insane increase of 10% of our income through capital. You still may be richer than me, but that gap is not going to increase in relative terms. So again, this is the objective, is to really delink the rising capital share from rising interpersonal inequality. So in all these cases, I've tried actually, when I argued for certain policies, to explain them with an objective which is sort of beyond the facts.
So this is an interesting point. May I actually take the opportunity to ask you something else about Rawls? Because when I was reading your earlier work on inequalities, I had especially because of this argument about what should be the unit of analysis. Yeah, should it be the nation state or not? I think yours could be read as a very, very interesting critique of Rawls's idea of equality in one society.
Yes, of course.
Right? So could you say something about why you think that Rawls is absolutely wrong in making the argument about the nation-state bound country kind of as being the unit of analysis in which one can think about equality at all?
I would not say that he was, in my opinion, wrong, but he was, how should I say, his unit of analysis in theory of justice, as we all know, is a single country. And there is a discussion which really pertains to the country only. When he looks at the law of peoples, his unit of analysis is the world. It becomes many of the things that is actually, I think, paradoxical, I believe, many of the things that he dismisses in the theory of justice as being, how should I say, undermining equality and so on, he just then takes them over when it comes to international scene as accepted. For example, he, of course, is very much against, in favor of helping the poorer classes domestically, as I just mentioned. But when it comes to the international scene, he doesn't see any moral principles that would require richer countries to help poorer countries. He basically, for example, on migration, he says he sees only you have to accept only religious or political exiles, basically, but nobody else. So money or income is not a good reason for you to go to the United States or elsewhere. So we reject. Secondly, when it comes to the transfer, he says the same kind of argument that he was rejecting before. He says, well, you cannot rely on the largesse of others. You have to work hard. And then if you need more money, well, you can borrow that money from the international kind of organizations that would actually lend. And of course, right-wing people could tell him in a theory of justice, so why do you want to have any transfers? Now, like, you can also, you're a poor person, but you really should work very hard and you should borrow because there is a, financial system in your country and you borrow, let's not have taxation for that. So I think that one can make quite a few arguments that the points that he made for within country, he somehow forgot them all when we started discussing international sort of relations. Now, last point, he might have been right on that by being a statist. So saying each individual country is different because there is citizenship and citizens owe certain things to each other. But we as citizens of country A do not owe except help in the cases of oppression. We don't owe anything to others. So that's just a justifiable position, but maybe some people might not like to put it in such sharp terms. I'm sure that even
this is a classical social democratic tradition because it believes that political community is the value itself. Because you are governing each other together. Because the moment in which you put both inequalities on the same moment, the idea of democracy is over. This could be a much higher level of justice, but if you basically are connected equally between citizens in your own country, with which you are sharing values and you are governing yourself together, and anybody in the world, there is no need, and by the way, of taxation, it's the state taxation. You don't have a global tax. It should be negotiated between states. And I do believe this is why he's doing this, but of course you're living in a world in which global inequality is becoming such a problem, also a moral problem for others, but you cannot solve it in this kind of a democratic community argument. And I do believe Rose is right. My feeling is that this is an interesting story going back to the demographic issues. Both capitalism and communism has one major problem when it comes to egalitarianism, and this is the family. So how you can love your kids as much as any other kid in the world. And this is the problem of inheritance. This was, by the way, the problem of communism in the 1920s. And this is the problem. Can you have, in order to have the world in which at least the opportunities are equal, you should need special relations between parents and children should be divorced, because the moment when I love my kids more than any other kids in the world, of course I'm trying to help them with the private lessons. I'm going to use all the positions that I have. And this is interesting in your idea of the egalitarian capitalism, when you see that, strangely enough, this is where the libertarians, the socialists and the liberals go together, because in a strange way, you have this idea of individualism, because only this type of individualism is allowing for kind of egalitarian utopia. In a certain way, you should kill the family in all its dimensions in order basically to go egalitarian.
Yeah, in Rawls, what is also interesting is that in the theory of justice is that a transfer of wealth between a family, within family, generations, is looked, as undesirable for the reasons that I just mentioned. That actually it would reinforce the social, it would reduce social mobility. But when you come to a very similar structure, when you come for transmission of intergenerational transmission of collective wealth at the level of nation state, that's not questionable. So it is an interesting situation that one questions my transfer of wealth to the children where the link is actually quite strong, but accepts fully the transfer of collectively created wealth of a given society to its members, to children of their members. And that link actually is much weaker because obviously this is a false. But that's not questionable in Rawls for the reasons that Ivan mentioned, because the community has its rules which are very different from the rules from the other countries. So he was, of course, that book is really very far from any cosmopolitan approach. And that was actually, I think, many people believing the roles from the first book somehow assumed that he would be fuzzy and nice and cosmopolitan in the second book, but he is as far from that as, no, it's not as far as possible, but it's actually quite far from that.
But I
It's
think
also a problem, yeah.
no,
Go ahead, yeah.
no. It's a,
Anyway, I want to say it's also a problem with social democracy, as even mentioned. The social democracy had always had a problem, which I think now is even exacerbated. It's the problem of helping people within the country, and obviously providing jobs, paid union rights, and everything else, and being international. So these two issues, they handled it very well in the 1960s because there was not such a great migration, and essentially other people that you wanted theoretically to help were far away from you. But it's much more difficult now with globalization, with mobility of capital, and with mobility of labor. And that's why we see this problem. I called it in the case of Denmark, I called it, sort of socialism, social democracy in one country. And we do see actually the conflict between internationalism that these parties in principle espouse, and the fact that they in real world are really concerned only with their own countries is really now becoming a very sharp, has come to a very sharp point where actually you see that these two things collide.
So this is an interesting point, but I wanted to also say something to your the Rawlsian explication which you had on that there could be an understanding that Ivan was saying that the collective wealth in a society can be passed on, but obviously the obverse of that is you're passing on collective debt in many other countries intergenerationally. You are not just passing on wealth, but you are passing on decades and decades and decades of accumulated debt across generations. So I think it's interesting how the Rawlsian kind of perspective is just unable to deal with the whole ethical and moral dimension of perpetuating debt across generations, which is leading to enormous inequalities, I think, between countries, as an obstacle even to realizing any form of equality.
But the transfer of debt, for example, take the US debt, or any other country debt, Italy. The transfer of debt is not so much a generational issue because the countries are not families. It's an issue, let's suppose in the next generation, Italy wants to reduce its debt. That would be the transfer from people who are working in the next generation and whose salaries would be taxed to the people or children of those people who have invested in government treasury bills. So if my parents have invested in government treasury bills, I'm going to receive interest and sort of repayment of the debt. So it's really not so much intergenerational thing as it is really transfer within, what should I say, within country, is a transfer from one group of people in the future who will be working and who would be paying that debt to other people who would actually have financial capital. So it's really more of a, what should I say, social issue, social transfer.
We've lost your image, Branko. I don't know why. There may be a problem with the Zoom.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly. So probably.
I can see myself, so I don't know what happened.
You can see yourself. Somehow we've lost you, the image. But no, I meant something different. I take your point for Italy, but this would not be the same point for Uganda or South Africa or Mozambique, where.
Being foreigners, yes.
Yes. And also for the kind of debt which these countries have, sovereign debt, which is actually they are just caught in a debt trap where they are, as a country, you will be unable to get out of it because of the borrowings on private markets or from the IMF or the World Bank. You are caught in a trap of just paying back your interest, let alone the capital. So I think there, the whole question which the Jubilee 2000 campaign raised of cancellation of debt was very much about not inheriting debt which is transgenerational. I think that is certainly.
No, I totally agree on that. Actually, obviously, when your debt is all to foreigners, and that, of course, then you're transferring that debt to the next generation, and that generation has to pay to somebody else. So yes, I totally agree.
So I think there is really a problem with the Rawlsian argument. I think we should be coming to an end. Let me give you one more question, which another former IWF fellow, so it's good to know that all our fellows are online with us. Even our current fellows are unable to be in the library thanks to the COVID restrictions with us. So let me read out one question and I'll give you and Ivan the final word. This is from Guzel Yusupova, who says, many thanks for this discussion. What do you think about the growing role of territorial inequality in trying to understand class? How does it affect national solidarity and an exclusionary nationalism? So I think this is addressed maybe to both of you.
Ivan, do you want to start?
No, listen, I do believe one of the interesting story about the two crises that we're talking about, the climate and the COVID, is kind of a reintroducing of the territory as a very important component of it. Because in a certain way, climate crisis makes it territorial. When we say that they're going to be a global warming and that they're going to be a negative impact, they're not going to happen at the same time everywhere. There are going to be certain places which are going to be much more devastated than others, and by the way, there are places which are going to benefit. For example, Siberia is going to discover how much cultivation land they have. So you have this. And then, of course, you have this story which is interesting, what you see during the COVID, in which for the first time, you have a kind of an interesting movement from the urban centers back to the rural areas. And I do believe that, of course, these major distinctions between when you're poor these days, basically we know where you're living, we know what you're working, basically where your income comes from. So it became a package. And quite often you know your ethnic or racial origin. So in a certain way, the groupings of the winners and the losers are really also clearly defined by territory. One of the interesting stories also on the political sorting out, which in my view in the United States became a big issue. 40 or 50 years ago, almost in 60% of the different counties in the US, one or the other political party can win the election. So they were very competitive. You're living next to people who don't share your political views, have a different interest, you're voting differently. Now in the United States, more than 70% of the counties are one-party counties. Basically, you're not going to see a Republican if you're in a Democratic county, or you're not going to see a Democrat if you're in a Republican one. So sorting out is one of the things that in my view also comes with the globalization. Because honestly, the market is not integrating in the way the state is integrating. State is the only great mixer, for many reasons. State is interested in social cohesion. Market is interested in efficiency. And from this point of view, it does not have this type of idea of cohesion, also on the level of territorial cohesion, also on the level basically of ethnic and other cohesion. So this is why I do believe one of the interesting stories to see now when the government is playing much more role, to what extent they're going to see the social cohesion as one of the objectives.
Can you still see me now, or I'm still?
Yes, no, we are now, you're visible once again.
Visible, okay, good. I was, if I understood correctly, the question is really territorial sorting within countries. And indeed, this is something we talked about, and this is the case. I mean, there is almost every country that you can pick these days that shows you not only Brexit, but we have seen really that very strong sorting, obviously, between Scotland and between London, as opposed to, Northern England, or you can take France and Western France, which was more pro-communist, and now it's more pro-Le Pen, and so forth. Or take big cities like Budapest or Istanbul that vote against the governments, where they vote against Orban and they vote against Erdogan. Likewise, also I think in Russia with St. Petersburg and Moscow. So it's everywhere. It reminds me a little bit of the early Christianity, you know, because it was a city religion, and that's why pagans were called pagans, because they were rural people who actually stuck to the old religion. So nowadays, the rural people basically are still have stuck back to not back, but they're still into the nationalist mode, whereas the elites have really abandoned that, and the elites are global. So they're like Christians of the 2nd century that are linked in a community, similar to Christians, using the lingua franca. In those days it was Greek or Latin, nowadays it's English. As you were saying, Chilean people, of course, put a huge premium on learning English, even if the parents themselves don't speak English. So it is, I think it is a remarkable change. I have to say that actually just made me think now that more than 20 years ago I had a paper which made a particular comparison between the early Christendom and globalization, because Christianity was also a globalizing force. It actually integrated people from different countries. It had the same narrative, it had the same language, and actually Paul mentions that how are we going to spread our idea is we are going to spread it through the use of the same language. And of course now that language, of course, is English, and it is the language which is also undergirding technological change. Last point on that, just notice the fact that we, because we are so much influenced with the English language, we don't notice when we go, and many Americans don't notice that until I point this out to them, how much there is English in titles of certain things in China. So you would have the title of the Ministry of Commerce or something, big title in the street, and underneath it will be written in English. You know, Huku booklet is written on the bottom English. So this is something quite amazing when you think of that fact, that actually the official documents of the 2nd largest superpower are sort of written with English language underneath. And that really shows you the level of globalization.
I think we have a lot of questions still open, but we need to come to an end. I mean, one of the kinds of questions that I would love to pursue with you the next time would be on the effect of this concentration of enormous wealth and privilege on political systems, on democratic decision-making, on the kind of party politics that we are seeing in the US, but also in contrast or compared to China, because one of the really interesting arguments